Lecture 22, Are Things as They Appear? Griffin, this appears pink. And this appears green.
Yeah.
Is this as it appears? Is this pink? What's your view?
Well, I would say the way we see it, it's pink. The way we react to the object, it is pink. But, like, for other animals who have different types of color vision or slightly colorblind people, they might not see it as pink. But that doesn't mean that our view is the right view of perception. So I think it's pink to us, but it's not really any specific color.
So how does the fact that some other animal sees it as having a different color, suppose that's right, how does that show that it's not actually pink?
Well, we see it as pink, but all sorts of other animals, don't stick them together, see them as all sorts of other different colors. So why would our way of seeing things, be the right way of seeing things?
What's the difference between color and shape? Griffin, you seem to have changed your view slightly.
No, I haven't. I haven't.
What about smell? Is that in the same boat as color?
Well, I'm not totally sure if we all smell things differently, but for some animals, I think the smell is a lot, stronger for them. So, for them, they would smell something a lot stronger, and they would say, oh yeah, this is a really fragrant smell. But for us, we might say, there's nothing here. But I don't think any of us is right. It's kind of like color. It's just, there's really no way to know if you're actually seeing the right shape. Well, I don't, to speak on that, I don't think there really is any right shape, since animals might see shapes differently.
So really, for you, I think it's, you think that perception helps an animal to survive and reproduce, and it doesn't really matter whether perception represents the world accurately to the animal.
Well, I don't think there is an accurately.
And you don't think there's an accurately...
I think the way that we see things is just to benefit our own survival, like what I said earlier. Like how snakes, since they see heat, they see rats as this vibrant red, in the midst of all this blue, cold stuff that really gets their attention, so they go after it. But we don't go around and chasing rats, so we just see rats as this dull kind of brown. And we also think they're kind of gross, because usually they have germs. Both of those things are to kind of, benefit our survival, like in snakes.
Yeah. So is this your view that the world is really a kind of formless blob, or maybe a collection of sort of formless blobs, which we see as spherical or lumpy or green or pink, or we feel them as rough or smooth, or smell them as fragrant or smoky, but really all there is out in the external environment are just these formless blobs onto which we sort of project these perceptible qualities. Is that your... I think that's your view.
No, because if they were all just formless blobs, then why would we be perceiving them as these specific things? I think they are sort of this formless matter that doesn't really have any specific properties.
So what if all perceivers were to vanish?
Everything that perceives anything, or reacts to anything.
Yes, exactly. So all life is wiped out, or we can imagine that maybe life never evolved. Would there still be green things or pink things?
I doubt there would be sort of any things. I think that matter still exists, but without perception, it can't really have any properties. So it doesn't really exist.
I see. So
there needs to be perception for something to exist.
But right.
That doesn't mean if you put something in a box and you can't see it, that thing doesn't exist.
But it's just that if you wiped out all perceivers, then really you'd wipe out everything.
Yeah.
Well, that's called idealism. And that's something that we're actually going to get to in Wednesday's lecture this week, when Abby and Elliot talk about Vasubandhu. This week you're in for a treat. Abby and Elliot are doing both the lectures. The first one is on Bertrand Russell. Griffin, let's have a look.
Hello, welcome everybody. I'm Abby.
And I'm Elliot.
Here we are on the slide in front of you right now. We are two of the TAs for Problems of Philosophy. This week we'll be taking over from Professor Byrne to teach you all about perception and to call into question whether the way the world appears to us actually corresponds to reality. What do we mean by perception? Well, we seem to be capable of perceiving the world in all sorts of ways. We're going to be talking not only about visual perception in these lectures, we're also going to be talking about the way in which we appear to smell, taste, touch, and hear the things around us. What is it to perceive something? Suppose I pluck this bauble from the Christmas tree. Before we've ever stepped into the philosophy classroom, we might think something like this. What I see before me is the bauble. The bauble is a mind-independent thing, which actually is as it appears to be. That is, the bauble appears red, so it is red. The bauble appears round, so it is round. The bauble feels smooth, so it is smooth. Okay, so here is one kind of more formal way of putting this pre-theoretic view that I just expressed. Call it the naive view of perception. The idea here is that what I see is the bauble. The bauble is a mind-independent thing, which actually is as it appears to be. So the naive view of perception appears straightforward, intuitive. This week we're going to be looking at a few arguments, however, which suggest that the naive view of perception should be rejected. To get you warmed up to the idea that things might not always be as they seem, we're going to show you a few examples of cases in which appearances don't actually correspond straightforwardly to reality. So in this clip, I am putting a straight spoon into a glass of water. You should be able to see that when the spoon is in the water, it appears to be bent, even though common sense tells us that the spoon itself is not bent. Here we have one thing, an appearance, which presents the spoon as having a property which it in fact doesn't have. The spoon itself is straight. Next, let's take a look at a little optical illusion. So I'm going to ask you to look closely at the red dot in the center of the screen and try to blink as little as possible for 30 seconds. When you've looked at the dot for 30 seconds, we will show you a blank screen and you should appear to see an after image where there actually is no image on the screen at all. So 30 seconds looking at the dot, blinking as little as possible, starting now. Okay, so if the illusion has worked successfully, you should see an after image of Taylor Swift, even though you are in fact looking at a blank screen. So we've just shown you two examples of optical illusions in which our perception does not appear to correspond well with reality. We tend to think of optical illusions as exceptions to normal visual functioning. So we think in these unusual cases, our vision is distorted, but usually we see things exactly as they are. This week, we're going to look at some philosophical arguments for the view that illusion is actually more widespread. That is, in general, what we perceive does not correspond with the way the world really is.
One of the arguments we're going to look at comes from our old friend Bertrand Russell, who we met during our discussion of the problem of other minds. For today, you hopefully read the first chapter of Russell's The Problems of Philosophy, in which he presents an argument for the conclusion that you never directly perceive ordinary objects. I'm going to briefly run through that argument now. Russell asks us to consider a table, which is every philosopher's favourite example of an ordinary object. My table here is a bit roughed up, but pretend it's a new table, fresh out of the table factory. We ordinarily think that objects like this have the same colour all over. But notice that, when we view the table from a particular angle, some parts of the table appear to have different colours from the other parts, depending on which bits are reflecting the most light towards your eyes. For example, in this photo of my table, notice that the right-hand side is reflecting so much light that it appears almost white. For another example, notice that the legs appear to be a much darker brown than the surface. All in all, the colours we perceive the parts of the table as having are not the colours which we like to think the parts of the table really have. Notice too that as we move around the table appears to change colour. It appears to be a lighter colour under some conditions and darker under others. The parts which looked particularly bright in the first photo I showed you at times now look much darker, and the parts which looked dark in the first photo I showed you at times now look lighter. Russell even goes so far as to claim that the apparent shape of the table changes as you view it from different angles. Sometimes its surface is diamond-shaped, sometimes it looks like a trapezoid. If you look at it from a perfect bird's-eye view, it appears square, and so on. From all this, Russell concludes the following. It's evident, he says, from what we've found, that there's no colour which preeminently appears to be the colour of the table. It appears to be of different colours from different points of view, and there's no reason for regarding some of these as more really its colour than others. And from this, he draws a very dramatic conclusion. To avoid favouritism, he says, we're compelled to deny that, in itself, the table has any one particular colour. That is, the table, the real table you take yourself to see, isn't coloured at all. Here's an exercise for you. Try and extract a valid argument from the reading to the conclusion that the table isn't coloured. Now Russell extends the argument further. We've already seen that he thinks that the apparent shape of the table changes as you view it from different angles. And he says the same thing about texture as well. Depending on how you're viewing the table, whether you're viewing it from a distance or with a microscope or whatever, the apparent texture of the table is going to change. Same with how it feels. If you wrap the table hard with your hand, it's going to feel different than if you touch it lightly. And even though it would be weird to go around smelling or tasting your furniture, presumably the same kind of argument from variation could happen there. All in all then, Russell concludes that the real table is colourless, shapeless, textureless, and probably tasteless and smellless. So, and this is the principal conclusion of the reading you read, the real table, if there is one, is not the same as what we immediately experience by sight or touch. Now, it's not obvious initially how this conclusion follows from the premises that the real table is colourless, shapeless, textureless, and so on. But we can think about the rough kind of story that Russell will tell. In general, if something is colourless, shapeless, textureless, it's just not the kind of thing which we're able to perceive. If all that's right, though, a natural question now emerges. If we're not seeing the table, what is it that we are seeing? Keep watching to find out. So, according to Russell, we don't directly perceive the table. But what do we perceive, if not ordinary objects? According to Russell, we directly perceive what he calls sense data. What are sense data? In the passage you read, Russell says the sense data you apprehend visually are colours. It's much simpler, though, to think of the sense data you see as patches of colour. And in fact, Russell shifts to this way of talking about sense data later in the Problems of Philosophy. So, when you take yourself to see the table, what you're directly perceiving is a whole bunch of sense data. A patch of dark brown here, a patch of lighter brown there, and so on and so on. Here's a highly accurate and technical diagram to help make this picture clearer. So, on the naive view, which we outlined in the first lecture, what you're directly perceiving is the ordinary object, the table. On the sense data view, what you're directly perceiving are sense data, so patches of colour. In the case of the table, presumably various patches of brown. You also directly perceive sense data with a particular shape. It's worth saying that while we have a visual example here where the sense data are patches of colour, of course, Russell wants to generalise his sense data view to things we can hear and things we can touch and smell as well. For example, on Russell's view, you never directly hear a bird. You just hear a sense datum that's high-pitched, melodic, shrill, and so on. And we haven't yet been told the exact relation between this collection of sense data and the ordinary objects. But for that question, see Wednesday's lecture. All we know so far about sense data is that we directly perceive them, and they're not identical to ordinary objects like the table. But can we say anything more than this? Well, in the extract we read, Russell doesn't go into much detail about the nature of sense data, but various theorists following him have. One thing sense data theorists tend to say is that sense data have the properties which they are perceived as having, which they appear to have. That is, if you have a perceptual experience of X, e.g. redness, squareness, roughness, shrillness, then there's a sense datum you're perceiving that really is X. There's a sense datum that is red, or square, or rough, or shrill. Take a look at our bauble again. On Russell's view, you're all currently seeing a sense datum which is red and a sense datum that's circular. You might have thought that the only circular and red thing around you right now is the bauble itself, or, in this case, the bauble on your screen. But not so on Russell's view. The bauble itself, or the bauble on your screen, isn't circular or red. Remember, ordinary objects are colourless and shapeless. While you are perceiving something that's circular and something that's red, these are just sense data and not ordinary objects. The third thing people tend to say about sense data is that they're mind dependent. Mind dependence is a complicated and tricky piece of philosophical jargon, and we don't have time to go into it in much detail now, but the simplest version of this claim for our purposes is that necessarily a sense datum exists only if it's perceived. While Russell doesn't appear to explicitly commit himself to this thesis in the extract we read, it's important to bear the claim in mind as we move forward to Wednesday's lecture. To make the mind dependence thesis clear, think back to the afterimage of Taylor Swift you saw earlier on. On Russell's view, that afterimage is comprised of sense data. Now, how long did these sense data exist for? Well, you might think, for as long as you saw them, and no longer. Russell thinks this about everything you see. Sense data just aren't the kinds of things that can exist without being apprehended by someone. They're mind-dependent entities. So let's go back to this highly detailed scientific picture we began with. I think we have two questions to ask now. The first question is this: does sense data theory seem like a good model of what goes on when we have perceptual experiences? Is it a better model than the naive view? The second thing, What goes in for the question mark here? Is there something standing behind the sense data we perceive, the table itself? If so, what's the table like? How do we know the table exists? Wouldn't it be just simpler not to posit the table at all? These last few questions are going to be the topic of Wednesday's lecture.
Better than Dad's lectures. Don't forget the quiz, due on Friday. And read Vasubandhu for Wednesday.